You're listening to the 2022 Nelson Arts Festival Pukapuka Talks. This session, The Crucial Decade, features Mike Joy, Paul Tapsell and Dave Lowe in conversation with Kim Hill.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks to the sponsors for this session, the Chia sisters and Sally Gepp, who is is it Gepp or Jep? Gepp. Somebody told me very carefully, thank you, who is an environmentalist and a barrister. Welcome to this conversation about the biggest problem the world is facing, an existential problem. In order to deal with it, we all have to change the way we live. And if you'd just been backstage with us, you will have realized what we all have to do. And I have to go home now. I don't have to tell Nelsonians about extreme weather events, but I believe your council declared a climate emergency about 3 years ago, so that will have helped. And I know that you're confident that next month, COP27, the UN Climate Change Conference in Egypt, will save us. 6 years ago, at COP21, world leaders agreed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And at this point, if you'll excuse me, that is a lot of hot air. And New Zealand's contributing to that. There seems no good solution. Save the world, kill our agriculture and tourism-based economy. Let us discuss. We're joined this morning by freshwater ecologist Dr. Mike Joy, whose criticism of New Zealand's 100% pure branding upset the agriculture and tourist industries. I believe he was called an economic saboteur.
And worse.
Dave Lowe is an atmospheric scientist who first sounded the alarm about climate change over 40 years ago. In fact, it's half a century this year since he helped set up the Bearing Head atmospheric CO2 program. He's written a memoir called The Alarmist. Dave Lowe attended the world's first atmospheric CO2 conference in 1975. And Paul Tapsell, Ngāti Whakawe, Ngāti Rokawa, is Professor of Indigenous Studies at Melbourne University. Former. Didn't last long, did it? He's principal at Takarangi Research. He leads projects including the effects of climate change and 21st century re-establishment of food and water sovereignty by tribal Māori. You will see books before you written by each of our three guests. And as you heard earlier, they'll be signing them after the show. I want to know whether we can be what the government aims to be by 2050, net carbon zero. Is it possible? I know it's not possible from where we are now, but if we were to change everything tomorrow, is it possible? Mike?
Well, I'm going to go one step further and say that how much I hate the idea of net emissions. I think it's a complete self-delusion. Humans are pretty good at self-delusion, right? But we've deluded ourselves that by planting trees to capture carbon, we can somehow mitigate fossil carbon. The whole problem with that idea is that the carbon, if we were to replant every tree on the planet, we would mitigate the trees that we've chopped down. We wouldn't mitigate 1 gram of fossil carbon, because the current cycle is not, the fossil carbon was laid down more than 65 million years ago. So we're releasing carbon from a pool that was so long ago, we can't hope to mitigate it with today. Or if we the other way of looking at planting the whole planet was that we might take up 5 to 7 years of our current fossil fuel emissions. So all we've done is kick the can down the road 7 years, and then we've got nothing left. So it has to be carbon zero by 2050, not net carbon zero by 2050. Either way, a huge task, but I just wanted to make it clear that I do not believe that the net zero is going to get us anywhere. It has to be carbon zero.
Dave?
Yeah, that's pretty bleak. We're facing an extraordinary problem. It's a gigantic problem, and it's a problem of our own making. The fact is that planting heaps of trees does pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and every gram of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that's there now will be there for thousands of years unless we have some way of removing it. And while it's in the atmosphere, it's adding to climate change, to atmospheric heating. So for me, it's all about steps. Starting, doing, each of us, every single person on this planet, all 8 billion of us, doing what we can to reduce our carbon emissions and thereby to reduce excess CO2 going into the atmosphere. So yes, I agree with you. I don't like the idea of net either, but it is a pathway which humans today can begin and track towards net zero by 2050.
We'll talk about that, because I think that Mike would say that it's a pathway that leads to self-delusion, but we'll elaborate on that. What's your take on it, Paul?
Tuatahi a ngā mihi a kia koutou, I ngā rangatira mā o tēnei whenua, o tauihu o te wako Māori. Tēnā koe. This is an interesting discussion coming from a Māori perspective, in that I grew up as a child with elders already seeing a change in our environment, and they were looking back at something that had started before their lifetimes. And the discussion that we're having today, talk about zero carbon and what that might mean, that's the whenua side coming from science in a Western paradigm. On the Māori side, what we're seeing is probably an extrapolation of that with the degradation of our people themselves. So though we can talk about this is a Western modern world problem that's been inflicted on the rest of the planet by the 10-20% of the wealthy, we have right here in New Zealand, we have some of the most impoverished communities as well. And these are the marae communities, the Kāinga communities that our projects are involved in. And I think we could create local solutions, bringing the tangata equation back to the whenua equation, and there's hope, or I'd say if we give purpose moving forward, our nation could actually show the way forward for the whole planet. At the moment, we are one planet, one place, one Kāinga, and we've got nowhere to jump off. So we need to do something pretty radical.
Well, that's the end of globalisation then, isn't it?
Appears so. Not that Māori have been a big part of it in the first place, though they are trying to. But what does that mean, at what cost? And
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, the measure of Māori success is how economically successful Māori are. That's the Western paradigm, right? You want to deny that. You say there's another way of measuring it.
Well, I'd say the way we need to start measuring this is in terms of well-being, and not least, if we're leaving behind a significant aspect of our social construct of being Māori, then New Zealand's failing. And at the moment, we've got massive social failure that's occurring in this country, and it goes right back to the long tail of colonisation, exploitation, and consumption that's led us to where we are today.
We'll talk more about the colonisation idea, but I suspect you're all more or less on the same page here if by colonisation you mean capitalism and globalisation. I'm not sure where you are on that, Dave. I'm pretty sure I know where Mike is, in that we need to change the system entirely. I question that project, Mike, because most people want to have a cup of tea and lie down at the mere thought of it. So where do you start?
Yeah, I know how hard it is because I know just from myself having to change, you know, how hard it is to change.
What have you changed?
I've changed what I eat, my diet. I don't eat meat and haven't for a long time. So I know how hard it is, but I also realise that we either change or we get changed. We figure out a way to manage our degrowth away from consuming the massive amounts we do. If we don't, it's going to come crashing around us. We can see all around us that it's starting to crash now, economically, you know, wars over resources, all of that kind of stuff. So we either do it or it's done to us, and I think it's, you know, the chances of surviving or having a happy life and well-being is much more likely if we manage our way down than if we just carry on with business as usual.
There's so many other things to worry about, though.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, and climate change, we have to remember, is just one symptom of an overshoot, a planetary overshoot that is threatening we have all these other existential crises that are coming at us. I mean, look at the figures. April 29th of this year, New Zealand exceeded its planetary capacity, you know, so our global footprint exceeded the planet and we're amongst
Just explain what you mean by that.
Well, from that date onwards, we're in deficit. We're using more than the planet can handle. So from 29th of April to the end of the year, we're in environmental deficit. And there's only a couple of countries that are even close to being balanced within that year.
Who are they?
I think Costa Rica and I can't think of the actual
Costa
country.
Rica's quite a...
Bhutan, yeah,
Bhutan.
maybe. But we're in the worst countries in the world when it comes to environmental indices. We're in the bottom 25% of all the countries in the world. And so, you know, we are the ones that have to change. I mean, I totally accept what Paul said. We've got some of the poorest communities in the world here. But 50% of New Zealanders are in the top 10% of affluence on the planet. If your net worth when you sell everything up is 140,000 New Zealand dollars, then you are in the top 10% on the planet. If your net worth is 1.5 million New Zealand dollars when you sold everything up, you're in the top 1% of affluence on the planet. You know, and so we are. Affluence and consumption and destruction and use of non-renewable resources are totally locked together. So this kind of thing that we've been aiming for as success is the most destructive goal we could have, and that's this incredible rethink that we have to do about what's winning and what's losing and that kind of thing.
Are you of that mind, Dave?
Sadly, Mike is right. But I would never ever pitch it that way because I work with a lot of young people. A 17-year-old Hutt Valley High School girl. I can't talk to her about that.
Why not?
What you're talking about, we talked about this before, is hopelessness. I will never ever give up. I've been fighting for 50 years. I've seen this horror for 50 years. And the fact is, we have the tools already. We know how to move ourselves towards zero carbon.
All right.
We know how to do it.
How do we do that?
Okay, it's a combination of mindset, the real will to do it, and realising that we can only do it one step at a time. And it is things like changing our diet. And in New Zealand, the tall poppies in terms of carbon emissions are the agricultural industry and transport. Transport is the fastest growing source of carbon dioxide emissions at the moment. A lot of that has to do with the fact that our light vehicle fleet is 5.5 million vehicles for 5 million people. It's nonsense. I don't know how it is here in Nelson, but in Wellington it seems every other week, Mike, you see one of these great big biscuit tin type ships arrives packed full of Ford Rangers. That's just nonsense. We should not be doing that. So that's on the transport side.
But hang on. So we replace those vehicles with what?
Public transport, bicycles. Hey, I'm 75, I ride a bike everywhere. My wife and I go shopping with our bikes. You have to choose your environment. You can't have a gated community 10 or 15 kilometres outside a city.
We had this conversation backstage, actually, and I said, you go back to capitalism, you go back to an economy where people cannot afford to live without both parents working. And if that's the case, you're time poor. And if that's the case, you need a vehicle to transport the kids around.
Yep, well...
I mean, this is the reality. You can't expect people to change if you're denying the fact that their lives are really hard.
Look, climate change implies change. We have to change. And you look over Wellington, there are many, many parents who have foregone the second parent working thing, and they use cargo bikes to get their kids to school. They walk to school. So we can do this, but it seems that a lot of people today are locked into expectations that, yeah, we can do business as usual. We can't. We cannot do business as usual. We have to change. And there are ways, as I said, there are tools that we can use to help us move towards zero carbon.
Do you have that? I'm not sure whether that's optimism or pessimism, really. I mean, it's optimism that, yes, we have the tools. I feel, the chances of us
pessimism, for me, comes to the fact that, okay, I was the first person in New Zealand to really realise this problem, and I was on my own. It was incredibly lonely. It was a time, if you've read my book, it broke me. It broke me mentally and physically. As time went along, more and more people became aware of the problem, and I realised we had to talk to politicians, and that I would liken to walking through treacle. It's just an impossible process dealing with someone who has a 3-year electoral term mindset and is not interested in long-term problems like climate change, education, all the rest of them. So that, it seems like our very political system has a problem dealing with climate change. So I think it's up to all individuals just to think about change. How do I reduce the carbon emissions in my present lifestyle?
Paul? Dave and I backstage, as we were talking about the similarities that my elders had around the same time as you became aware, conscious of the issues that are before us, and how they were noticing a shift in the Māori, in the energy equilibrium of the environment, and that as a child they were talking about that. They had that past, the pre-science and the past science of seeing the degradation that was happening in the environments. And for my generation today and the new generation coming through, we've grown up mostly urban. We're no longer part of the whenua, though we still are referred to as tangata whenua. And the access to well-being through transport is a necessity of life that Māori have never been, generalisation, but have not had a very large say politically. And I like the treacle analogy. Going back into a Māori space of my elders, it was just an exclusion from the conversation. And the covenant that represented the Te Tiriti back in 1840 of being considered equals, and the promise and the giving of the whenua in a way to invite in and manaki a British Crown to come and be part of our society, part of the landscape, the whenua. We're still waiting, and I know the elders talked about that with tears, that still waiting for that to come back locally. And that's the issue here, is how do we respond locally to a global situation? We can't try and, from New Zealand, change the world, but we can show a way. And I think to show a way, we've got to get right back down to where this whole process started, at least in a New Zealand context.
So tell me more about the Kāinga, which is at the basis of your philosophy.
Well, some of us will know it as Pā, or Papa Kāinga, or Marae, and these were the signatories to the treaty. It wasn't some abstract iwi construct, And you won't even find the word iwi in the treaty, except when we refer to the people of Queen Victoria. They were called iwi. But the hapu and the rangatira, they entered into, in Article 2 in particular, entered into an agreement that the Crown would protect their chieftainship over their whenua, their kāinga, and their taonga. So the whenua being the estates, and it's the soils, the waterways, the microclimates, the kāinga being the people, the villages, their engagement as communities with the whenua, and the taonga is the resources that they harvested, protected, and passed on to future generations.
Can I just say one thing? Which is going to irritate the shit out of you, I know. But when Māori arrived here, they brought kiore with them, which devastated the wildlife. And then they proceeded to burn down vast tracts of the forest. Now, do we edit that out when we're talking about Māori living in harmony with nature constantly?
Exactly the same argument was raised at a debate in Oxford in 1998, at which I was present, but not participating. And the science under which that premise is based is debatable. The kiore was a protein source. And the kiore, yes, it entered into our bush, but we ran trap lines and we caught the kiore, we managed the kiore, and the fire discussion about that, you're talking a wet, semi-tropical forest or subtropical temperate forest here, not something easily burnt down. Even only today with the climate where it's going now that we're actually starting to see what fires can do. And meanwhile, the more...
I was going to... read my mind. Let's quickly attend to the more, because I've led you down the aforementioned rabbit hole.
No.
Yes.
You're going to rabbit hole.
What about the more?
So the more, again, a lot of the species were already in decline. They were, like New Zealand was a life raft that's been existing for millions of years on its own, and our species that survived and populated didn't have natural predators. And so the more, like many of our native species and birds, their reproduction was slow and in stasis with the environment. And then when we have the changing climates that have occurred over hundreds of thousands of years, and the habitat changes with that, so the more was easily tipped over the edge. It was already, like many other species here, human occupation will create stresses.
Are you not undermining your argument about climate change in that that's what people say? The world is always changing. Climate's always changing. Evolution is always changing. Flora and fauna, they come, they go. You're making it sound like, how do you know that we're facing an existential crisis?
Well, when they come and go over thousands of years, that's okay, but when it comes and goes over a decade or two,
Yep.
I think we're kind of in a different paradigm of discussion.
All right. Mike, thank you. What does your vision of Aotearoa look like in order that not only, well, it's not even a question of us surviving, it's everybody's got to do what we do, right? Otherwise it's not going to work. It's like some kind of weird pyramid scheme. But what's your vision of Aotearoa?
Okay, well, I mean, I think, and this kind of comes back to what we were talking about a little earlier. In my lifetime, in our lifetimes, on average, New Zealander uses twice as much energy as we did 50 years ago, right? So I was running around living we're talking about cars and kids and all that. My mum didn't have a car. The family had a car that got used on a Sunday.
Yeah, but did she have a job?
No, she didn't have a job.
She was a homekeeper.
Yes, exactly.
You don't get many of those.
Yeah, I know,
these
but
days.
that's part of the change, Kim, right? It'll be that is this whole crazy we have to do everything, have everything world has to change. That's part of the change, and I think New Zealand. It's so frustrating being a New Zealander, knowing how we could show the world how to do all of these things. We have everything going in our favour
But
here.
that's theory, right? It would be lovely if we didn't want so much stuff.
Yeah.
And we didn't get used to having the television and the 2 cars and the house and the big garden. But nobody expects the big garden anymore. People feel that they have constrained themselves
don't know, don't you
and they're nasty about it.
I think I had the feeling in the first lockdown, right? You know, and I'm sure so many people I know did. We were fortunate, right, that we lived in a place where the streets were ours again. The kids took over the streets. Cars stopped running. Planes stopped flying. The whole world felt so much better, you know. And I've personally had experience, and I think you've had similar. I spent a couple of months on the Subarctic Islands with no technology, no planes, no electricity, no nothing, and how amazingly, and sailing, you know, this is what I do.
You realise how
really simple,
privileged you sound.
Oh, exactly. Yes, but it's all it is it's a hint that you don't need all this shit. That life can be a whole lot better without all this stuff, you know. And so, for me, it's not a depressing thought to not have all this energy, you know, this consumption and this energy, you know, consumption. It's a positive thing. If we can get there, it'll be a much, much better world. You know, how much of what we want is marketing, you know? Are we just convinced that we need to have all this stuff, you know? And you know, capitalism will provide where there's a want, right? And so there'll be all of this stuff that we consume. And so much, I mean, I just want to give this example because I was just working on it recently. I was looking at bottled water sales from New Zealand, right? We export, I think it's $240 million worth of bottled water per year. We import $270 million worth of bottled water every year. You know, this idiotic amount of energy that's tied up. 50% of the food we eat is imported, and yet we could easily feed this country, you know, with beautiful local food.
You're right. That makes no sense at all. What do we do about it?
It's a really hard political issue, isn't it? I mean, I've seen how hard it is for politicians. My friend, the local mayor, Jenny Rowan in Kapiti, introduced water metering, right? Saved 30% of
Paying
water.
for water?
Yeah, so
outrageous.
Yes, exactly. We reduced water consumption on the coast by 30% overnight with that, and she got voted out straight away. You know, it's any politician that makes the kind of tough decisions that we need will be very unpopular, and i.e. they won't do it because they won't be around. So that's not going to be an option for where the change is going to come from.
Oh, well, sadly, Mike, we live in a democracy. What do you say, Dave? Democracy rules. You have to compromise. The politicians cannot go too far ahead of the general population, or they will get voted out.
Okay, but first of all, can I answer the question you put to him, the vision for Aotearoa?
Yes.
My one. And that is that all of us, everyone here, everyone in this amazing country feels the country. I'm sure that every person here has been in the bush. You go out there, you go out on your own and you feel something. You feel like you're part of it. You go on a beach, you feel like you're part of it. And the reason is, you are part of it. We're all part of it. Papa Tuanuku, the Māori Earth Mother, gave birth to all things, including humans. And it seems to me, as a scientist, that modern science has only just caught up. Earth system science, where we have three giant reservoirs, the atmosphere, the oceans, the terrestrial biosphere, all in harmony. But now, humans have the ability to actually change that. And we've entered a new geological era, which is called the Anthropocene, because we are capable of changing a whole planet. So I think we have to really get back, feel the land, feel what there is, and realise that we have to change, and we can do it. So that was his question. So politics, you know, I don't really want to go there. I've had such a bad time trying to do things with politicians that now my focus is getting out, climate change outreach, talking to groups like this, getting the message of the alarmist across to as many people as possible. You could work with politicians. What do you think? Someone
Sounds vaguely like an insult to me.
Yeah.
Don't take that sitting down.
Because we can change. We can do this.
Paul?
I'm stuck on the word democracy, actually. From a Māori perspective, if you're going to use democracy and it's the majority that rules, Māori are always going to miss out. Because we are only at
But only if you're
20%.
But only if you're a homogenous group.
Only if.
And
So
there is
if
a
you're-
danger of
So
that.
if you're a Kāinga, you're even smaller than that homogenous group, and your voice becomes more and more limited. And if you're trying to act locally, such as, say, Bay of Plenty, and we've got all these different Kāinga around the Bay of Plenty, each one of them is struggling to try and make a difference. I mean, they're trying to get their mum and dads that are working, their kids not eating Kentucky Fried 4 or 5 nights a week. One of the communities working with, they've got no running water, they've got no sewage, they've got no electricity, and are 3 kilometres away from one of the wealthiest town centres in New Zealand, Katikati. So this idea of democracy is something, again, that has been implanted, to the C word, and the net result is...
By the
it
C word,
has
you mean
silence.
colonisation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Just checking.
So the sum total of democracy, when prior to that, we had succession. That was done through capable leadership proven over a lifetime. And that's why elders were so valued. They had the wisdom of hindsight and the trust of a community. They made themselves accountable to the community. And if they weren't accountable to the community, oh boy, did our nannies take care of them. So this is something we're losing with the board table Māori democracy that we've got today. And there's fantastic things happening around the iwi boardrooms, the PSGEs, but it needs to go back, those resources need to go back
What's
to the local
PSGEs?
post-settlement governance entities. And that needs to go back to the roots of why we call ourselves Māori, the Kāinga. That's
Will
our
it, though?
identity.
Will it?
That's my hope.
I mean, this sounds like a trickle-down theory that's been discredited quite recently.
By,
Well, UK, for starters.
oh, yeah, well, I can't speak for them. But I
But
can
don't you
speak
think, I mean, this is the idea that there is some kind of brown table who's making a lot of money and it's not trickling down. Why would it trickle down? Do you think it will?
Let's look at it another way. Orake. It's got a $1.3 billion asset. They've set up their own insurance schemes. They've set up their own. I mean,
Insurance schemes?
Yeah, 30 years ago, health insurance. 30 years ago, they had a quarter-acre cemetery. That's
All right.
all they had.
So you have to tell me what the difference is between an insurance scheme and an evil capitalist system that came via colonisation. Because it seems to me that you're cherry picking a bit.
Oh, I think I'm not so much cherry picking. I'm talking about how leadership can work beyond democracy, beyond the biggest voice gets in and the water meters get thrown out.
All right.
And don't get me started on water. Because we did provide that water for the nation, and if we're going to be charged for it, especially those who don't have clean water anymore.
Don't talk to me, talk to him. He wants to charge you. And it does seem reasonable, right?
If you give something.
Well, it's a scarce resource.
Well, not in Rotorua, it isn't. We've got all those springs, all that water, and okay, my niece has just come in as mayor, and boy, we're going to give her a hard time if she starts charging us.
I was going to ask you whether you were related.
But we gave and we gave and we've given again. And right across all the Māori communities of this country, we believed in the idea that the treaty, Te Tiriti, represented an opportunity to share in the resources and the bounty of being New Zealanders. And we're still there wanting to participate.
Waiting for the bounty.
No, waiting for participation, being asked to be included, and also to look at how we can look at other leadership programs, other leadership models that can complement democracy but take us to a new level. I don't like co-governance. I think co-governance is not the right word. Shared governance.
Crikey. Should we go down that particular rabbit hole, ladies and gentlemen?
So
I'm really interested to know. Oh, God. I'm really interested to know why you think co-governance is not a good idea.
Because co-governance means it's but like having the captain of a ship and a co-pilot. What about shared piloting? What about a twin-hulled waka and we meet in the middle? Here's the Māori side, there's the Pākehā side, and that is the future of our nation.
I sort of thought that was what it meant.
Well, if it means that, then
Co-governance.
correct me if not. But from what I'm seeing of co-governance, it's still within a democratic framework. We've got to recognise there's two different value systems that have operated here. And those value systems are each important, whether it's from the science side or a mātauranga side. They've got to sail side by side, work together, and it's in the centre that our nation lives. That's what I think.
From now on, ladies and gentlemen, we're just going to operate through signs. Can we talk about agriculture, please? Which is, of course, the cow in the room. Agriculture and tourism. Tourism's coming back, ladies and gentlemen. Which area of New Zealand is not happy about that? We need the money. They're going to be flying here, but they'll be paying for offsets, so everything is going to be fine. Not so, Mike Joy, I believe you say.
No, but the agriculture thing's more, the area that concerns me. And
Is it worse than tourism?
Well, depends how far we let tourism go, but
Well,
yeah.
we let it go fairly far before COVID.
Yeah, well, I mean, 50% of our emissions come from greenhouse gas emissions, from agriculture.
All
so
right,
I think
well, let's
that's a good place
concentrate
to
on
start.
agriculture.
Yeah, and
Would you eradicate dairy?
I wouldn't eradicate dairy. What we've got at the moment is an industry that gets some kind of almost religious awe where we can't diss it. Dissing
Well, that's
dairy.
not true, is it? We diss it all the time.
Well, slowly we are, but I mean, it's...
Anybody a dairy farmer in the audience?
But it's...
Not that you're prepared to own up to.
If it was about making milk, though, Kim, it would be fine, and that's what it was, pre-1990s. We were producing milk, and we were making butter and cheese and that kind of thing. And then along came nitrogen fertilizer because, we haven't got all day, but we basically took a deal where the gas was prospected off Taranaki. We had a take or pay scheme, so the government had to run around coming up with ways of using gas. And one of them was a Kapuni plant to turn the gas into nitrogen fertilizer. So we suddenly went from a very sustainable form of farming to a very unsustainable form of farming, which is making milk from fossil fuels.
That's a really interesting chain of events, right?
Yes, yeah. I mean, they're all linked, and you get to the point where farmers, we were producing nitrogen from clover, naturally, from the atmosphere through clover, to suddenly industrially producing it. Massive increase in stocking rates and intensity, massive increase in the amount of nitrogen that got lost to the freshwater system.
Before
and
we
caused
get
all sorts
there,
of problems. Yeah.
massive increase in productivity.
Yeah, but
massive benefit to New Zealand's economic balance sheet.
Yeah, okay, so we could argue about that all day, but what we did was we industrialised the process and produced milk powder, so you had a product that had a shelf life that you could then export. Most of it isn't reconstituted as milk. It doesn't come back as milk. It's a junk food filler for a huge, industry overseas. So we're
feeds
not
babies. Feeds babies,
some
Michael.
of it feeds babies, but because we convince women, we're part of a huge marketing scheme to tell women that they need infant formula and that it's superior to breast milk in a whole bunch of countries.
No, I'm not going to be lectured by a bloke on how important it is to breastfeed.
No, but that's the point. We are part of a global industry that convinces women to use infant formula. I mean, I had a PhD student from Vietnam who had her baby here, went back to Vietnam, got spat on in the street for breastfeeding, and she showed me the adverts, and the people of Vietnam are convinced by the advertising that breast milk is bad for your children and that infant formula isn't. But let's get back. It's a small part of what we do. We're not feeding the world, we're providing cheap protein, for things you would never recognise as dairy, chippy coatings and all manner of processed food. So that is an income earner that doesn't pay its costs. If it had to pay its environmental costs within this country, we wouldn't be doing it. It would be a nil-sum gain situation if it had to pay its costs. So we're subsidising harmful land use to bring in overseas funds, but we're subsidising it with the future. We're subsidising it because no one's actually paying the cost, except for Lake Rotorua, the two examples, Lake Taupo and Lake Rotorua, where we pay farmers to not farm in those catchments to protect those two lakes. In the rest of the country, we let them go. We let the harm be done. We let the harm be done for future generations. Huge increase in nitrous oxide emissions as well, so a climate change problem happening from that. So we've got this thing that is so revered because it brings in money that is so harmful to this country. And
However, we do need to earn some money. No, we don't. All right.
well, we
you
do.
live on the smell of an oily rag, madam. What would you do, Dave, to earn a buck?
Okay, so we're still talking about agriculture,
Well,
right?
yeah.
And Mike's absolutely correct. It's over 50% of our CO2 equivalent emissions, so that's methane and nitrous oxide as well as CO2, from the agricultural industry. If you look worldwide, the land area, we hear a lot about urban sprawl, but in actual fact, all of the cities, including Nelson, take up less than 1% of that land area. Agriculture is now more than 40%. Huge tracts of land have been used for agriculture.
Yeah, well, we're feeding the world. We're feeding the world, Dave.
We're feeding the world, Kim, but how are we feeding the world and why are we feeding it that way? And those are the questions that we have to answer.
So what's the alternative?
As a scientist, I look at innovation, the ingenuity of human beings as quite extraordinary, and there are now many other ways of producing protein which are far less intensive on land area than farming beef cattle, because 8 billion people cannot eat protein from beef.
You mean soybeans or laboratory stuff?
I think ultimately we're going to have to go to microbial
Because anybody
production.
can do that. I mean, how are we going to pay to fill in the potholes? We need a point of difference, don't we?
We do, yeah.
What
So,
would that be?
Yeah. Take a step back to the early 1970s. At that stage, New Zealand was sending huge hunks of meat only to the UK. That was our number one market. The UK joined what was then called the EC, the European Community, and we were told that farmers were going to go to the war. They didn't. Why? Because farmers are very innovative. We now have a multi-billion-dollar wine industry and horticulture and aquaculture.
Mike, is wine all right?
It would be, if you look at the Wairau Valley and count the number of treated pine posts that go into the ground there and what's leaching from them, then again, it's not what, it's how we do it, It's the same with dairy. There's nothing wrong with dairy. It's how you do it. It's the same with wine. If you take the organic wineries that are not allowed to use those tannalized posts and not allowed to use all the petrochemical additives and pesticides and all that kind of stuff, then you can make really sustainable wine. But you can also go completely the other way and turn into this industrialized model that has huge impact. So,
And that has tended to be the case in the wine industry.
well,
is it
whenever
not?
we sort of drive for this maximising thing, that's the inevitable road, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, it's returns to scale, isn't it?
But that income thing, how much of, in fixing the potholes? Well, if we didn't have all these huge cars,
no.
we wouldn't need to fix the
I
potholes.
knew you'd say that.
But, and it's the same with the big screen TVs and all the tech and all the magic stuff. I mean, and the warehouse and all of those places. I mean, we sell this a beautiful place to be able to have the money to bring in the screens so we can look at the beautiful places that we don't have anymore, because you see the trap that you get into within technology.
Mike, I just told people to go out and feel the country.
Yes, exactly. That's what we need to do. Throw the screen away, or you don't need the dairy industry because you don't need to buy the big screen anymore because you've got reality out there to go to. So,
Paul, if we're going to empower the Kāinga, empower the local community, put it in charge of its own fate. How?
I'd suggest the way to construct that argument would be around looking at where we were, where we are, and where we're going. Where we were as a nation of protein, we had one of the best, starting with the forests and the nutrients provided by the forests and soils down through the waterways. Our marine life and our
Kia ora. Yum.
our pipi, our tuatua, our coda, the proteins that came out of our waterways for the amount of energy that they consumed and the amount of protein that was produced was one of the most efficient protein producers in the world. And we have managed to pretty much kill that all off with a very inefficient cow in the room. So the reality for Māori, for the Kāinga, is that we currently have an expectation of riparians around these waterways to protect them. So we've come a little ways down from the forest. The forests have receded way back up into the hills because of all the pasteurisation that's occurs. And if we, for example, did a 20-metre riparian on each side of every waterway that came down out of our forests, what's left of our forests, we're rejuvenating the forests, bringing them back down the waterways, someone's going to have to manage that. Going to have to manage the pests, we're going to have to, and someone's going to have to be, quote, kaitiaki, to protect the rebuilding of that riparian all the way down to the harbours, into the oceans. Right now at Makatu, from where my father grew up, our pipi, especially our kuku, our mussels, they're full of worm. They're dangerous. We don't eat them. They will infect you. They've got leptospirosis and they've got all sorts of nasties that are like hanging out of that.
Do mussels get leptospirosis?
Yeah, I mean, this is coming out.
Because they suck it up, right?
Yeah, they
it's
suck
horrible.
up that. So what we've got here is we've got a two-pronged crisis. Nothing like a good crisis. Don't waste a good crisis. And at the moment, Māori have been, since the last 175 years, willing to labour their land, but they're not going to labour someone else's land. Now, if those riparians, and through the Crown, could become covenants, or what we call a whenua tōpū, and that the local communities, the Kāinga, actually belong and control those whenua tōpū, those riparians, it provides an income stream, and it provides them purpose. It provides people trapped in urban poverty in the cities to come back and develop their own economy again that's based around securing the future of our nation ecologically, and also it gives the farmers a leg up because it's providing far better protection from soil erosion, etc., etc., etc.
Right. So that makes a lot of sense. How much traction are you getting on that anywhere?
In the Bay of Plenty, the conversations have begun, and there's a couple of pilot schemes underway, and it's now a matter of the communities working with the Māori communities, the Kāinga, working with the Pākehā farming communities. And at the bottom of all that is healing, not just healing of the land, but healing of the people, healing of what happened in the past and how the land transferred from one group to the other, and now here's a way for them to come together and share in the future for all our children.
Mike, I suspect that the recent proposal from the government based on consultation with the farming industry is neither here nor there to you, because you think it's all pretty much a waste of time, given that, I mean, if they're going to tax methane at the farm gate, that's an advance, but not enough, you think?
Oh, well, they've pretty much, I mean, that what they're talking about is a tiny proportion of the harm that's done being taxed.
Well, you've got to start somewhere.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I know, I've heard that one. But, I mean, we're just isolating it into climate change. If we took into account the nitrate loss and the harm that, that Paul was just talking about in his community, that intensive agriculture does, it's not just about greenhouse gas emissions, and you have multiple gains from reducing intensity. Halve the number of cows, you don't halve the emissions in half. You way more than halve all of those harms that are done. This is an exponential increase in those harms as you intensify. I mean, our stocking rates of cows are 2 or 3 times that's allowed in the European Union. We are outliers in this space, And so if if we stop siloing things into climate and water and all this kind of stuff and think holistically, coming back to an indigenous
Who's going to do
worldview.
that?
Well, this is the role of the government to do it, isn't it? But they don't. They love siloing things. We have departments of this, that, and everything, and ministers of this, that, and everything. So that overall pulling together thinking of a systems thinking we talk about in science is the way to understand and to fix the problem by taking into account the multiple gains that could be had.
I can't help thinking, Dave, you're old enough to remember the when Thatcher tried to close the coal mines in the UK, right? I can't help wondering if that's a situation farmers might find themselves in. That there is sympathy for them, it's a lifestyle, they're important, we love them very much, but they've got to go because you can't carry on mining milk anymore.
Yeah, I don't think they have to go. I don't agree with that. The fact is, to be a good farmer, you have to understand the land, you have to understand the atmosphere, you have to understand the water. And there are many farmers in New Zealand who do that. But sadly, our economy involves profit and a profit motive for everything. And there are many farms, that they're loosely known as Queen Street farms, aren't they? Where the people working on that farm are employed by someone in Queen Street to make a profit. And once you start doing that, every year you have to squeeze the maximum out of their taonga, the land, the air and the water. It's never ever going to work. So we have to take a step back, think about what do you do with that land. And to me, rewilding, paying farmers to rewild, and that involves planting native trees and wetlands, and literally paying them to look after that. You're going to solve all kinds of problems. And as Mike just pointed out, in terms of destocking, this really is an exponential effect in both directions. If you increase stocking, degradation goes up exponentially, but taking those beasts off the top and coming down is the same effect. You start reducing that impact.
You've got to take
So it's
on
a whole different concept towards farming. I grew up on sheep and dairy farms in Taranaki. It's in your blood. It's always there.
Yeah.
We are people of the land, but we have to look at it in a different way, and that's why I said, go out into the bush, feel it, feel the land, behave towards it differently, because what's going on now in terms of climate change and planetary change, in geological history, this is more like an explosion than the slow rate of natural climate change.
What would you say, Paul, to farmers, many of whom are Māori? I mean, Ngāi Tahu's into the dairy business in a big way, right? What would you say to them about how to approach the future?
I wouldn't dare say anything to them, to be honest. But I would listen very carefully, and what I would look for is common ground. At the moment, our Māori agricultural industry is in the Western commodity game, but that doesn't mean they're not looking to reach back into the kin group accountability of Kāinga. And there's 780 Kāinga across the country, and each one of those Kāinga to which every Māori belongs, they represent the opportunity for these big industry to reflect and to give back. Now that's a different value system than the one of fulfilling your shareholders. Most of the ahu whenua trusts that I'm on or involved in or have shares are shares, and the quantum of belonging to of being Māori is based on how much shareholding you have in this trust or that trust. What's happened today is that the majority of Māori have such a small share, it's not worth anything, and they don't feel they've got skin in the game anymore. I think what Mike's talking about here is if we can find a way for every young Māori growing up today to feel they have skin back in the game, and whether it's through the whenua that their ancestors grew up, lived, died, buried, and it's through a riparian process or through assisting the farmers in developing the ngahere to protect their soils, that to me is the thin sliver of door we can walk through. And it means we go into a space of not ownership, but belonging. And I think that's something that Māori can give to all of New Zealand, is the art of belonging. If we go there, this is, I think, the future pathway for New Zealand.
Kim, I'm working with Ngāi Tahu at the moment. So Tamari Tau and I, a historian at Canterbury University, and I are writing a book at the moment on Te Mana o Te Wai. So put the river first, which is part of this new national policy statement for fresh water. And it's the opportunity, I think, to turn around what's happened to fresh water, is that total reversal. In the past, it's been the economy comes first. Now it's the opposite. It's the river comes first, the water comes first. And that, if we can just... this is the opportunity. It's in the legislation, but so was a lot of good stuff in the RMA, but it never was pushed forward, and I think it's the opportunity we have once now to actually make that happen. But I, my experience with Ngāi Tahu, and they are into dairy in a big way, but back to the C word, was part of that colonisation process was the settlement required them to set up this corporate body. And a corporate acts like a corporate, I mean, it's another version of colonisation. You kind of recompense some tiny proportion of what was taken away, but you make them corporatise it, and it acts like a corporate. And so within that, I mean, Ngāi Tahu would be as diverse as any other group of people, but there are this kaitiaki group in the middle who say that the water is the most important thing, and the health of the people is the most important thing. If we have to get rid of cows, we have to get rid of cows. And I kind of kept thinking when you were talking about the farmers are the victims in this as much as the environment is the victim in this industrial process. It's Fonterra that's pushing, it's Dairy New Zealand that's pushing. The farmers are trapped into this highly indebted, industrialised world. They don't have the choice to do the right thing. I've got friends in the industry. You slow down buying fertilizer, and the bank's on the phone straight away. What's happening? They see
really,
a risk
really
in
hard,
it.
right?
Yeah.
So how do you work through that without throwing people onto the heap?
The only way we do it is like we've done it in the Rotorua and Taupo examples. We pay farmers not to do it because they're locked into the system. And like Dave said, that money could go into rewilding or, the farmers who have the experience, there are a bunch of them that are getting into regen, or if they've gone to once a day milking and they've backed off, and how much happier the land is, they are, the animals are, everything, It's so much like what we're doing in urban New Zealand. The harder you drive the system, the more you pressurise people, and that's speeding everything up. The worse it is for everybody. I mean, there are winners, the banks win, and I'm sure the CEOs do nicely out of it, but at another level, there is no good comes out of it.
Dave, do you give me some good news? Because you've stressed the importance of hope. You've stressed the importance of optimism. You've said you will never give up hope, which seems to me to reduce the currency of hope, if you'll excuse me for saying so. But nevertheless, there's got to be something we're doing right.
Okay, I'll tell you what, Kim, the good news is the news. And by that I mean when I go back, I have, for a substantial part of my life, battled climate deniers and skeptics. It's been horrible, fake news, false balance stories. What we're seeing now is brilliant investigative journalists. Some of them work for Radio New Zealand.
They do.
The Guardian Weekly, it's a non-profit organisation. So many examples of really good investigative journalism out there, and they will not stand for a microsecond's worth of crap from a climate denier. That's, to me, is really good news. So we all know what's happening now, and a lot of it is courtesy towards good journalism. The facts are out there. Climate change, unequivocal. We know it's human-induced, we know what's happening, and we know how to stop it. So that is one of my pieces of good news.
Climate change campaigner David Tong said this. He said it's not enough to show people we face a climate crisis. We also need to build a new narrative of how we can solve it together. That's the hard bit, right?
Yeah.
Because, I dare say almost everybody in this room agrees that we're facing a climate crisis.
Yeah.
But and then what happens?
Okay, so you asked for a bit of good news. So there was the plug for Radio New Zealand. Okay. There are a whole lot I've already talked about tools and pathways. I have worked with young climate activists. I've worked with older people. I've worked with probus clubs. I had the temerity suggest they should go out on bicycles, and that didn't work too well. One step at a time. We cannot. It took 250 years for us to get into this mess. We're not going to solve it overnight. But yes, this is the crucial decade. That's the name of this session. This is the decade where we have to start tracking down. We have to, in order to avoid the onset of dangerous climate change, we have to have our emissions tracking down by 2025. And the good news is that there are a lot of countries who already have their emissions tracking down. Denmark, the city of Copenhagen, will be net zero carbon next year.
That's not good enough, is it, Mike? Net's no good.
Okay. So we can do this. The mentality is there. I'm not going to go into the political space again, but it's up to us, to the people, to feel the land, and that's why I keep on harping on about feel this amazing country. Go out there and realise that, yep, one step at a time, I have to reduce my meat consumption, my transport, carbon emissions. Look at what is it that, where are the tall poppies? Where are most of my emissions? And work on that. Work the problem.
We also, and I take your points, and I take your point about community in Kāinga and the importance of feeling rooted to the land and to your community. None of you want to talk about politics because you all seem to think that it's, a bit of a waste of time and counterproductive, but it's a fact, right? That pressure needs to be put on politicians if we are going to change the way we run things in this country at large. How do you do that?
Well, having come from a long line of politicians, and there's no way I'd become a politician, but what I have realised sitting around the dinner tables of many politicians is that the real work gets done by the bureaucrats. And the politicians are there, and they come, they go, but it's hitting the pinch point in our political system is actually the chief executives and the bureaucrats that are there through the thick and thin. And if you can help them drive the agenda we're seeking, then they will drive the politicians in the right direction to be able to make it palatable to the democratic public. There's so many different aspects to how we approach this, but I'm thinking of the good news is Papa Tuanuku will survive no matter what. Now, whether we're part of it, and I see with my children, the generation under 20, hope, and also a sense of purpose, and also not afraid to call out our generation now and saying, you're causing the shit we've got to clean up. And that is where I believe the good news is coming from. Now it's our duty to support that. And within the Māori space, it's even doubly more critical because this country needs Māori to participate in a partnership process that is essentially about our whenua and how tangata and whenua can come back together again. And that means all tangata, and that's what the Māori value system is about, manaaki. It's about service and belonging. Everyone that's born, lives in this country, is part of the whenua now. We're organically made of this whenua, and we need to now find a way to be accountable to that whenua at a local level and work with the communities, those Kāinga, 780 of them.
Can we talk about adaptation for a moment, or mitigation? You all flew here, right? As did I. No shame in that. Because Air New Zealand will be planting offset pine trees. Is that what it does? Please explain. How does that work, Mike?
It doesn't work. I mean, yeah, it's a way to encourage. Like, the last thing the airlines want is for people to realise that there is no future in flying. You know, especially long distance. You can do some short distance stuff with battery planes, but there's no future for, you know. And so they're never going to admit that. It would be just fatal, wouldn't it, for them to admit anything close to that. So that we're always going to have them telling us that there's a future in that, and it's not just aviation. So to allow people to not feel guilty, they give them this option, you know, of planting a tree. My colleague Paul Callister's just done a paper on this, on Air New Zealand. And that whatever couple of dollars that you would pay on that flight does not go anywhere near, even if we forget the fact that I've already mentioned that trees can't mitigate fossil fuels, okay, even taking that out, that you would have to, if you wanted to have it happen within the next 30 years, how many trees would you have to plant? And if they were native trees, how many would you have to plant? And then you would be talking about a cost that would be equivalent to the airfare or more. And so, you know, it is a marketing greenwash ploy, and the world is full of that at the moment.
Will we have a tourism? Can we have a tourism industry and still become carbon zero?
We can have flying here is not the only way to get here. There are far less carbon intensive ways of getting to New Zealand.
I suppose.
Yeah, no. There are ships that are less carbon intensive. I'm not talking cruise ships either, but you know, there are other ways to travel. But I don't think that realistically, round the world, long distances travel is part of our future, and so we need to face that reality, you know. And it's a luxury that we have to understand that we've been around for, you know, 300,000 years or something, and there's this tiny little blip, this few seconds at the end of that time, we've had this pulse of fossil fuel that's enabled this whole world that we take for granted because it's all we've ever known, and that it's just a one-off. We've blown it now. It got us to this point where we've kind of destroyed our future in having this big party. It's a weekend party. The party's over now. We're realizing that we've trashed the house. We're all got a hangover, and we need to change, you know. And you know, that's where we just have to stop deluding ourselves and you know, get real.
What do you say, Dave?
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty intense, Mike. So I'm a scientist, and I have a background in electrical engineering as well, and I know that there is a lot of technology out there that's going to wean us off carbon. I don't think it's realistic for us to quit flying. I looked very carefully. I've hardly flown at all over the last few years, but I did fly here. I looked up. It was 34 kgs of CO2 emissions flying here from Wellington and back.
Your share of it?
And your share.
No, but not like a plane load.
A plane load divided up with the fuel and the
Right.
propeller. How's your father? It was 82 cents is what Air New Zealand charged, which is nonsense. If you work that out, it's $21 a tonne carbon cost. The current emissions trading scheme cost for carbon is about $81 a tonne. But if you think about what is the true cost of the damage we're doing to the atmosphere, it's extraordinary. It's difficult to figure it out, but you remember those incredible fires in Australia, 2019 and 2020? 1 billion animals died.
Sorry.
1 billion animals died.
The clock
What is
stopped.
the cost?
No, genuinely, the clock stopped.
Okay.
Sorry, carry on. I
Yeah,
just had a
so-
moment of panic that it was like 1 o'clock.
Anyone need to rush off? So we have never really truly costed the damage to the atmosphere and the damage to the planet. But there's no way that we're going to shut down aviation overnight, but there are ways, pathways, to get us towards net zero carbon. And I would not call them greenwashing.
What are they?
They are definitely techniques that are being developed by people in the United States, all over the planet, ways which will wean us off carbon and get us towards net zero carbon.
I mean, you're not talking about electricity or e-vehicles, because they're just another problem we're storing up.
We've got electric bikes and I can't see them flying through the air, not at the rate I pedal them anyway. So
Hydrogen?
hydrogen is one which I don't like because it's an incredibly inefficient way of transforming energy.
Right.
You're up against the second law of thermodynamics, Kim.
Yep.
Okay. For short haul flights, very definitely electricity. What's really bad is biofuels. Air New Zealand have done some tests, and I mean this really is greenwashing, where they made ethanol out of corn.
Yeah, but that's a whole nother nightmare, isn't it?
Terrible. I mean, you could have fed families for probably decades, centuries, on the amount of corn that was used to make.
Well,
this
it's
one.
all right if you use the bits that we can't use.
Yeah, and there are techniques where you can make isopropanol, for example, out of switchgrass, which is a junk weed. So all of this technology is out there. How do we use it? One thing that worries me, if we get into the same kind of corporate competitive model that we're running the economy on, you're back to square one, where there's this drive to over-intensify farming and so on.
Right.
So a new economic system. I'm not an economist.
Kim, can I just say...
He signed up for your revolution.
No, well, I just wanted to say that it's a realisation that hit me hard a couple of years ago when I finally got my head around it. But if, say, we came up with a magic fossil fuel tomorrow that was carbon-free, harm-free fuel that would power everything, would that be a good thing? No, because it would enable us to destroy all the other things. So the only hope I have for the future is that we run out of energy.
You're talking about the energy paradox, right?
Right, but the more energy we have, it enables us to
more we
overfish the oceans, to destroy all the forests, to do all the bad stuff that we're doing now, was enabled by fossil fuels. It's not just the climate change is one part of that, but that free pulse of energy that enabled us to do all this stuff is what is destroying the future for us.
As a matter of interest, we will have questions from the audience if the lights will come up and you stick your hands up. But I just want to know from you, Paul, I'm interested. Us white folk say, oh, we'll have to settle down, we can't fly overseas all the time, blah, blah. Do you think that's weird? Because why would you want to?
Was a part-time Māori. Half of me thinks it's weird.
Yeah.
And the other half...
Is it because we're white that we yearn for foreign parts because that's where we came from?
No, I think it's no different from what Māori, our ancestors,
Exactly.
It's exploration.
If there'd been flights, you would have taken one.
What's over the horizon?
You just had to paddle.
Yeah. Just like, I think we're still human. And
I wondered, I wonder whether it was a Turangawaiwai thing. You know, you've got your place to stand. Maybe we haven't quite yet.
I think that's what we have as human species is we've always had places to stand. We've always been mobile. We've always been explorative. We have looked for opportunity over the horizon. And at times, as a society, we've worked together, we've harnessed energy. I mean, Oliver Cromwell going into Ireland, it was all about harvesting the trees. to build the ships, to drive the United Kingdom, the kings of England in their wars against France. I mean, whether it's the mullahs in Morocco or the Ottoman Empire, energy was critical to expansion. The paradox that represents in terms of putting into a Pacific context is that the energy that was used to explore the Pacific for 3,000 years was wind. It was not carbon. And the trees that were used to build the sailing ships, the waka, and everything was biodegradable because the steel, and they had access likely to steel, they knew about Japan, they knew about, it corroded. Even the best stainless steel today corrodes in the ocean within 10 years. So you became efficient in the use of your energy to maintain that human spirit of exploration. So the tūranga waiwai that we are looking at for Māori today within Aotearoa, it's only a brief moment in our human expansion in the Austronesian colonisation, civilization of the Pacific of thousands of years. So we're no different from Europeans or any other cultural...
Well, it's time to go home and stay home. Questions from the audience, please. Can you stick your hand up and we'll get a microphone coming to you. If you have to put your hand, there's one over there. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess as the first questioner, I should say thank you for the opportunity to have this great discussion. And we opened the discussion by saying it was a existential crisis, and then we have talked extensively about how much it's going to cost us not to die. My question to you, as a panel, I suppose, is if we are faced with absolutely necessary challenges, we're not in a position of just making incremental household decisions. We're in a position of having to have broad societal changes. Do you agree with that? Are we past the point of just making household decisions and personal changes? Are we not in a very different, problematic situation?
Well, you held that in for the last hour. I suspect that Mike, for one, will agree with you. Mike?
Yeah, I realise that incrementalism is not going to get us there. This individual versus, I hear all the stuff about 70 big companies that are responsible for 90% of the emissions or whatever, but they wouldn't exist if we didn't buy their stuff, It's no good screaming at oil companies and buying oil, because they wouldn't exist if we didn't buy their oil. So, yeah, we're past the point of incrementalism. We're seeing the huge, loss of ice and the, real impacts of climate change coming. Look at Pakistan. Incrementalism's gone. We have to make big, hard steps and really, really fast steps. This decade has to see us utterly change how we live, or we don't have a future. So, yeah, I agree.
Dave?
Mike. Look, I'd like to give you some numbers. The total CO2 equivalent carbon emissions at the moment are about 40 billion tonnes per year. There are 8 billion people on the earth. That is 5 tonnes per person, CO2 equivalent. New Zealand's emissions are currently around 75 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent gases. That's 15 tonnes per New Zealander. So my wife and I, in a fairly short space of time, were able to cut down. We were at that average, 15. We were able to cut down to 5. So when it comes to incrementalism, I think, yes, all of us can cut our emissions, as I said before, by looking at the tall poppies. Where are most of our emissions coming from? So this is possible. It's not inevitable that we're going to face dangerous climate change. We're definitely going to face climate change. We already have, especially here in Nelson, floods hit by an atmospheric river from the tropics. But dangerous climate change, we do not want to go there. That's when we go more than 1.5 to 2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. So we can do this, guys.
Paul.
I agree totally with incremental. It's too late for that. And the only thing to add is we focus so much on being a land people that we need to also focus on the ocean. And it's the ocean that really concerns me. The changes we're seeing of the ocean coastal close in, but out in the deeper ocean, it's sucking up all that energy, and it's going to get to a point where it won't be able to do that anymore, and that's when existential will become right on our doorstep crisis. It'll affect our climate in ways we can't even imagine.
Well, we share your urgency, sir, but I'm still not sure how not being incremental is going to get us there, because we all have to own our own actions, as Mike pointed out. We all have to be responsible in what we buy and what we consume and what we do. Unless we do that, then we're just shifting the problem onto somebody else, right? So can we be individual as well as societal is the question, right? Is there another question out there? Hands up. Yes.
Kia ora, Kim, and great panel, thank you. I'm Lindsay from climate strategy company Resilience Limited. I've got a question on construction, but I would just like to respond to one of Dave's comments about I don't know how the fossil fuel thing is in the Nelson region. Right at the beginning you mentioned that. Very quickly, we're about the world's worst in terms of driving fossil fuel private cars. If you look at Stats New Zealand, if you look at OECD records, we're right up at the wrong end of New Zealand, and New Zealand's at the wrong end of the country. Coming back to construction, we're just celebrating that the government has put a whole lot of money into building houses. Nelson has just improved a very substantial and controversial development in one of our valleys near here, and yet we don't.
Is that the one in Richmond?
No, this was in the Kaka Valley up the Maitai River.
Oh, okay.
And yet we don't know how to build buildings that are less than about 10 times the carbon footprint that our research establishments say we can do. I would like to know what the panel thinks about making that transition. And Paul especially, I know Kāinga have an important role in that. Thank you.
Paul, you might like to comment on that first.
Yeah, no, that's a very important point, and currently working with one of our communities that are exploring Kāinga development, and it's how to build it in a way that harnesses local energy, closeness to resources, and doesn't buy into the Western model of consumerism. So we're looking at what does a Māori economy look like within a Kāinga construct. So this is right on the edge of what we're thinking. Kia ora.
What does it look like?
Not like what we'd see where is happening in Rotorua right now with emergency housing. It will look like where people can function. A great example is up in northeastern Arnhem Land 3 years ago, looking at their Kāinga developments, and you had the elders in the middle, and then all the way round were all the homes, and all the front doors all faced onto the elders, and so the elders had direct engagement with the children and the grandchildren, and they hadn't had any suicides there in 10 years. I mean, that's showing a functioning community that was harnessing the energy. They're just a whole different way of doing it. Their value system, third language is English, and they talk about Australians, and that's another country to them, even though they live in the construct of Australia.
Interesting, yeah. I see hands up. I'll rely on people carrying the microphones around.
Thank you. Kia ora. My question is similar to the person behind me. I'm interested to know. I think everyone in this room probably who's come to hear you would be making personal changes already, or what might be called incremental changes. What are the three areas that each of you panellists think we could be lobbying our councils or government to be making change in? What are our top three priorities?
Very good question. Mike.
Well, I think we should be lobbying our governments to put the true costs onto business. We should be paying, I would like to see the greenhouse gas emissions or energy footprint of products that we import loaded onto the product, not the country. So we just get this externalizing of emissions to China, that make countries look good, but all they've done is push them offshore. So if those, whatever you're buying with the money from dairy that brings into the country had its true cost associated with it, then the price would make it so that you wouldn't want to buy it because it would be too expensive if the real costs. And we wouldn't be doing dairy if the real costs were on it. Then we would level the playing field, and then much better land uses would come through, because they can't compete at the moment because we subsidise harmful practice. So true cost economics. And there is a version of that I'm part of a degrowth Aotearoa group, and there's some ideas that have popped up all over the world, but it's basically around a carbon quota. It's a bit like rationing, wartime rationing. Each one of us gets a carbon quota at the beginning of the year, and it could be in the form of like a credit card or whatever. And if we don't use our carbon quota, then someone else can buy it off us.
That's like ETS.
Yeah, but it's an individualised one where each one of us, because we all have that share that Dave talked about,
right.
and so that way
so the more
it's
carbon
very
quota
equitable.
we have at the end of the year, we can sell it or
we
get
can
money
sell
back
it.
for
We can get extra money for it, and if you want to go travelling off to the Himalayas or whatever, then you will be having to buy it off us. So that's
right.
That's another way of doing it. That we could push the government to do that, to put the real costs instead of subsidising harmful stuff, is to make it equitable.
Yeah, interesting. Dave?
Yeah, I agree with Mike. We have never, ever truly costed the damage that we're doing to the atmosphere, to the water, to the land by burning this stuff. We've never done that. What is the cost of 1 billion dead animals in Australia? We've never done that. So if we really start jacking up the price of carbon emissions to really represent, in crude economic terms, the damage that we're doing to the planet, it will change our whole behaviour. Whole industries will disappear, new ones will develop.
Paul, you got a priority?
Over 80% of our emergency housing is Māori, and the Kāinga to which they belong, if the politicians and the bureaucrats can see that this solves both sides of the equation by finding a way to overcome the emergency housing homelessness and the debt that Māori are carrying living in cities, and linking it to the deficit of people living in rural areas around the Kāinga, and using the waterways as a vehicle to re-engage tangata with whenua, that alone is going to create a new horizon of hope and create an opportunity for the next generation of purpose to turn our lands back towards a carbon zero space.
Crikey, everything's connected, right? Next question. One more question. Are you telling me only one more question? Because the clock stopped.
One more question. No pressure. Is this on? Oh yeah, cool. So I want to sort of draw on something that actually a good friend of mine, who's actually in the audience right now, has said, because I'm part of a number of climate activist groups, one being Extinction Rebellion, and this person has said, if we want to look at the climate crisis, we have to look at how we treat our most vulnerable and, impoverished. And I really want to see, because I don't actually see it, I don't think ever mentioned really in climate spaces, is how we're treating animals. If we're talking about like things that are laboratorized and like artificial and stuff like that, the animal that's actually been experimented on the most in Aotearoa is cows, which might actually surprise people because most people think animal experimentation, mice. What I'm trying to ask is, like, in terms of the climate crisis, can we start looking at how we're treating our animals? Because our cows are spent. Like, they've given us so much, and we can't keep relying on them, to hold up our economy. Like, they deserve a life. Yeah, so I'm just wondering, what do you think about that in terms of, like, animal morality?
Thank you. I suspect this goes exactly to the form of agriculture that we have in this country, does it not? Any comment, gentlemen?
As a long-time vegetarian, I'd be very happy that we don't have animals in our diet and we don't kill animals. And you know, that the statistic that kind of tells us so much about how we dominate the planet is that 97% of the biomass of animals, and include birds in that, and it's even higher, is us and the animals we eat, which leaves 3% for the wild animals on the planet. And so clearly, even without climate change or anything else, we are forcing the biggest biodiversity decline that the planet has had by the way that we live. And so eating animals is a part of that we could easily do away with. So I support that as part of the whole reduction, and the way we need to change is killing animals to eat is domestic animals is something that could easily go.
Yeah. We were talking about this in the green room, and we made an exception for wild and introduced animals. But I suspect you, madam, would not. I suspect you would say that they all deserve to live, including possums. I don't know. Good. No, good decision, because we're, right. Dave.
Yeah, we're on a finite planet. There is no room. You can't feed 8 billion people now, and we're projected to go up to 10 billion humans on protein from beef. It's never going to work. It's just going to destroy our only home.
Paul?
Well, the majority of this planet population doesn't eat meat anyway, or if they do, very scarcely. I'm just thinking of our populations in Africa in particular. They're suffering drought. For them, eating meat is a privilege of the Western world, and I believe that's a privilege that's overdue to be finished.
So, sorted that one. Thank you all for coming. We are out of time, even though my clock says we've still got another quarter of an hour to go. Please thank our guests. They will be out the back signing books, and I appreciate it. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you. Amazing.